James exhaled deeply as he set down his bag, looking back to see Shida close behind him. "We got everything right?" he asked, for what must have been the 18th time by now, and eyed both of their suitcases suspiciously, as if looking at them really scarily would somehow make them confess whether or not they were packed with everything they had initially come here with. Shida rolled her eyes and shook her head. "We looked through the entire room and found nothing. If there's anything we left behind, it literally cannot be anything important," she assured him, with some slight irritation at his constant questioning. James chuckled through his teeth, apparently finding her annoyance endearing. "Yeah, you're right," he then said, and leaned his head all the way back into his neck, closing his eyes as his face looked up to the station ceiling. "Not like we brought all that much anyway." He then groaned in slight frustration, shaking his head incessantly as his thoughts seemingly became consumed by the topic that would not leave his mind at the moment. "I can't believe she won't let me talk to him," he said, wasting no time on any sort of introductions, confident that Shida would know exactly what he was talking about. And obviously she did. The topic had come up a couple of times recently. Shida gently bit her lip with one of her long fangs. "Well, she's not wrong when she says that we have other things to do, and it's technically none of our business," she said, and trying to be as amenable as possible, since some part within her still told her that it was a bad thing to get angry over orders given to you by your superiors. However, she then made a similarly frustrated noise as James had, as her mind forcefully reminded her that she had some different perspectives now. "But yeah, it annoys me as well. But short of something really reckless, we can't do anything about it." James repeated his earlier groan, and lifted his hands to cover his face for a second, before slowly dragging them down, pulling the skin of his face along with them slightly, before it snapped back into place once his hands slid off completely. He then lifted his head again and glanced around at everyone else, causing Shida to do the same. Everyone seemed to be ready to go. Well, almost everyone. Curie would of course be staying behind for the time being, at least until their legal troubles were rectified. However, although she was here, Moore was also standing a bit apart from everyone else. The large, though when compared to his owner rather small, purse-like bag that held her few belongings, hung lazily around her shoulder as she stood off to the side talking to her family. They were speaking loud enough that Shida would have been able to hear every word they were saying, even at this distance, had they only talked in a language that she would understand. However, whatever it was that they were saying, it sounded quite emotionally charged. With a glance, Shida noticed Jane staring at the scene quite intensely, as Moore leaned in to give an embrace to her daughter-in-law. "You know, if you want to tell her to stay with them, you can just do that," she informed him with her arms crossed, causing James to glance up in surprise, as she had seemingly snapped him out of his thoughts. After taking a moment that he seemingly needed to even realize what she had said, James quickly shook his head. He then let out a long sigh and scratched the side of his head. "It's not that I want that," he said, and looked Shida in the eyes for a moment before turning his head back to the touching scene again. "I'm just thinking it might be better, but I know she wouldn't want it either." "She's made that point quite clear," Shida chuckled, and nodded her head sideways in a concurring manner. As she said that, she noticed that Moore had seemingly said something that didn't seem to sit quite so well with her children. The large, dark one, her son, had the mildest reaction as he opened his eyes wider in surprise. The one that looked like she was just a smaller copy of Moore lifted a claw to her mouth in mild shock. Meanwhile, the one with the brighter fur made a face that Shida only knew from back when Moore hadn't spent much time around carnivores yet, and had to observe her eating meat. Apparently whatever their mother had told them was varying degrees of objectionable to her offspring. However, she then repeated and reinforced her point with a calm and caring, yet still quite firm voice, one that Shida sort of associated with the idea of a mother, even if she had personally never really come into contact with the concept herself. The expressions on her children remained unsure, but they shifted into hesitant. Well, understanding was the wrong word. So was agreement. Appeasement probably fit quite well. Whatever Moore had asked of them, it seemed like they were going to do it, but they probably would be complaining about it the entire time. Moore then proceeded to give each of them another long embrace, gently stroking her claws through their long fur as she did so, before pulling away. She swiped her hand along her arm to fix the strap of her purse, that seemingly had become dislodged from her shoulder during the hugs. Then she gave her children and daughter-in-law a deep bow, leaning her head so deep that her horns pointed down at an angle and exposed most of her nape. Her children returned the gesture, and after a moment of confused hesitation, Zarabi tried to do the same, though her anatomy wasn't quite made for it, and it looked a bit more like she was bearing her horns at the old woman. After that, under much waving and further goodbyes, Moore came walking over to the rest of the group, seemingly ready to go. Shida was so distracted by that scene that she almost hadn't noticed the sound of claws scraping across the station's floor, closing in on her from behind. Almost. "It's a bad idea trying to sneak up on us right now," she informed with a smirk, while only her ears turned slightly to meet the approaching person for a moment, although her voice caused James next to her to shoot around completely. "We just wanted to make sure you're not running off without saying anything again," a familiar voice replied, and only then did Shida also turn around to meet the sky-blue eyes of the avian behind her. The dark feathers on Cliff's face stood up slightly as they made eye contact, and she could see his pupils pin ever so slightly. "After all, who knows when the next time might be that we get a chance to catch up with each other? And at the rate you are going, you're going to be Fleet Admiral the next time I see you." Thither and Pippa were both accompanying Shida's former colleague, and the snow-white feathers of his mate ruffled slightly as she left her man to talk to the feline, while she walked right past to exchange her goodbyes with James. Shida chuckled at Cliff's words. "I think my progress may be stalled for a good while from now on," she said, with a slightly sheepish shrug, admittedly enjoying that tongue-in-cheek compliment more than she would have thought. "But your phone does have a call function, in case you really are worried about catching up." Cliff chuckled slightly and made a chirping noise. "Right," he said thoughtfully, and it almost sounded like he truly had forgotten that contact wouldn't be entirely cut off this time, once they had left each other's physical proximity. This split wasn't quite as extreme as the last one. He then clacked his beak a couple of times before asking, "So, do you know where your trip will take you yet? If you can talk about that." Shida chuckled. "Not exactly a secret," she replied. "Open campaigning doesn't exactly fit with secret missions. We're heading to Geralitton." "Geralitton?" Cliff repeated, and seemingly needed to think about that name for a moment. "But that's a core world, isn't it? Homeworld of the Kolyulvari, if I'm not mistaken. What do you want there?" His gaze narrowed a bit, and his feathers stood up some more as he thought about it. And he wasn't wrong to ask. As one of the community's founding species, Kolyulvari weren't exactly high up on the list of the people that were most likely to support their ideas, in any way, shape, or form. Still, Shida smiled a bit. "It's about time we visit another old friend," she informed the avian, before reaching her arms out and stretching for a moment. "Besides, we've made more than enough wind around Deathworlds already. If there's any place that we need to try and gain ground, it would be the core worlds. Last time we were there, we definitely made headlines, but I'm not sure we left the best of impressions." "Better than not leaving any impression, I guess," Cliff replied with another chuckle, and briefly crossed two of his arms, while the other two picked at the crossed arms' flying feathers. "But wouldn't your efforts be better invested into people you actually have a chance of convincing?" "They'll still see what we are doing," Shida assured him, with way more confidence than she felt about it, before leaning in and more quietly adding, "Also, it's what the experts back home say we should do, so we're kind of going along with that because, honestly, we are like woefully unqualified for this sort of thing. I've been in the military my entire life, and James has a degree in genetics and biotechnology. Nothing that exactly screams politics." Cliff's chuckle turned into a full-on, slightly chirping laugh as he tilted his head and replied, "All right, I'll give you that." While he slowly let his laugh fade out, Sheeda looked back at him and asked, "So, what about you? Where are you heading next, or will you be sticking around here for a while?" Cliff quickly got his laughter back under control as he cleared his throat. "Well, with the conferences fading out, the need for additional medical aid will likely also subside soon around here. However, we still have our license for the tent for a couple more days and will likely ride that out," he explained, before lifting one of his hands to scratch the base of his beak. "But after that, I'm not sure yet. Feather probably will have something lined up. Not like there is going to be any lack of large gatherings of people now that the election is going into full swing." "True that," Sheeda replied with a nod. "Watch out for yourselves out there." "You don't have to tell me," Cliff replied and lifted his hands, before using one to point at Sheeda. "You, on the other hand, should make sure that you don't look even worse the next time I see you. Between claw marks and lost arms, who knows what will be added to the collection next?" Sheeda nodded. "We'll be sure to watch out for that," she said. Then, after a long moment of hesitation, she stood up straight and brought both hands behind her back as she pushed her chest out, standing in the Miad version of a salute as she looked at him. Cliff's pupils once again pinned as he observed her, and he quickly stood up straighter as well, towering over Sheeda as he crossed his forearms in a way that had his upper hands resting on his shoulders and his lower hands resting on his hips. For a moment, they remained in those respectful poses, looking straight ahead before slightly tilting their heads up and down respectively to make eye contact again. "I know you don't really use that phrase anymore for a couple of complicated reasons," Cliff then said, as he allowed his posture to slowly drop again. "But I mean it when I say, success to you." Sheeda felt a weird sting at the use of the old goodbye that most people in the galaxy used on the daily. However, she also understood what Cliff meant by it. "Thanks," she replied, not quite bringing herself to repeat the phrase back at him. A few moments of awkward dead air then emerged between them, as they both dropped completely out of their respectful postures, neither apparently quite knowing what to say. Luckily for them, only a few moments later, Coco climbed on top of her suitcase not far from them. Now standing slightly elevated above the humans, though still below the eye level of the larger ones of their companions, she loudly addressed the assembled people. "All right, grab your shit, everyone," she called out, clapping her hands together. "We're moving. What's not in the shuttle in 5 minutes gets left behind." Sheeda smacked her lips in amusement. "You heard the lady," she said with a shrug, and picked up her luggage. "Yeah, don't miss that," Cliff chuckled, in a tone that clearly slightly reminisced about his own military days. "Be well." "You too," Sheeda replied, shouldering her suitcase and walking towards the shuttle bay. Chancellor Zerlanican was admittedly slightly anxious as she sat at her desk. The water in the wet half of the room gently splashed as it was moved around through filters by gentle pumps so it wouldn't go stale and smelly as it sat in the room. Admittedly, her ancestral instincts to flee into the water when overwhelmed by stress were rearing their ugly head very slightly today, as she had to fight down the serious need to take a dip before her guest would arrive. She of course knew that in many other cultures, it was generally seen as rather suboptimal to be dripping wet when going into an important meeting. For now, she also suppressed her urge to be more proactive and go ride the elevator down to personally pick up her guest. The "let them come to you" mindset was quite important when dealing with a Tenastrocyte after all. Especially since she had not yet met this new head figure the people of Tuwam Ramstrold were sending to her today. The planet had gone through quite the shift ever since the trouble with the humans began. Of course, she couldn't quite fault the old Varash Crash for stepping down. She would have been lying if she claimed that she hadn't at least thought about doing the same. But no, the people of Paidialome needed a leader right now. And if they still wanted her to be that leader, she was not going to decline. Suddenly, the elevator leading directly into her office dinged loudly, grabbing her attention. After just a moment, its large doors parted and granted her vision on the person behind them, or simultaneously allowing for said person to slowly enter. Zerlanican had to admit, although she had obviously seen him on some broadcast before, watching the man slowly and carefully skulk into her office now with her own eyes still was a bit strange. The Tenastrocyte's body was long and quite slender, compared to what she was used to from the species, almost seeming more like a Paracene's build than that of a Tenastrocyte, even though the reptiloid still had a bit more meat on his bones than most of their feathered cousins did. He was also quite short for a Tenastrocyte male. His large front molars that were currently sinking into a thick, soft carpet had longer and more distinguished fingers than those of his bulkier conspecific sported. And, most striking of all, the thick armoured plates covering large parts of his body didn't show the usual grey to indigo colouring, but dipped into a vibrant violet-purple instead. Their surface was also gently reflecting the light, much shinier than their darker compatriots tended to be. Most of Tuoram Stroll's landmasses were concentrated on the planet's northern hemisphere, and although admittedly she was likely not very well educated on the topic, and therefore might have made a way bigger deal out of it than she had to, as far as Zerlanican was concerned, this was the first time that a Tenastrocyte of the southern subcontinental locality had as important of a role in their society as this one had. Of course, her own Paracene brain immediately sprung into action with its own instinctual recognition, and told her that, this must be a male Tenastrocyte. And while that was factually correct here, it had absolutely nothing to do with the man's specific appearance, no matter how much her ancestral brain wanted to spin her a story of sexual dimorphism, similar to her own people here. Quickly shaking her body in a way that made some of her feathers stand up, she shooed the thought away, before standing up to meet the Tenastrocyte on eye level. And, to her own slight surprise, she actually reached it. "Welcome, Chief Wilhelmuth." She greeted her guest, and lowered her head into a bow. And, quite unusually as far as she was aware, the chief returned the gesture, bringing one of his molars forwards while bowing his head.
"Chancellor," he repeated, "it is an honor to finally make your acquaintance. As the Chief of Foreign Affairs, I should have made time for our closest ally much sooner. However, I think we both can't deny that our current time is rather tumultuous."
Although raspy by nature, his voice emerged from in between his rows of sharp teeth smoothly, the raspiness almost adding to his texture, as he spoke in a controlled manner. "Tumultuous is putting it lightly," Zerlanican sighed, and looked away for a moment to hide a brief welling up of emotion. When she looked back to him again, the chief seemed to have developed a sudden yet deep interest into the aquatic half of her office, all four of his burning orange eyes staring at it with a quite intense focus. Then he let out a low, bellowing sigh.
"Although it has been a while at this point, please allow me to still offer my condolences for your fallen friend," he then said,
greatly surprising Zerlanican with his words. A Tenastrocyte offering condolences for someone felled in a duel? Unusual indeed.
"Despite the cause being noble and the outcome being necessary, it is still a tragedy that it has come to this."
Zerlanican sighed, her beak clacking for a moment, as she lifted a hand to briefly touch the natural mask covering large parts of her face, pretending to seemingly wipe away some dirt from it, though, in reality, she simply used the movement to cover her eyes. "She knew what was at stake," the Chancellor explained, with her eyes still covered. Then, only slowly, she removed her hand by allowing it to glide down her beak until it fully slipped off the curved tip. And I am by far not the most affected by her passing. She then cleared her throat and slowly settled down in front of her desk again, her legs bending as she lowered her body down onto the soft carpet. But we are not here to reminisce, she said, and gestured for the Tenashtasite to join her on the other side of the table. Please, make yourself comfortable. Chief Wilhelmarth did not need to be asked twice, as he quickly walked over to her, slowly lowering his body as well. Up close, the sheen of his natural armor was even more remarkable when Zerlanican compared it to the memory she had of his predecessor.
Indeed,
he said with another low bellow, as his stomach touched down on the soft floor beneath him, his eyes soon beginning the, for his people, typical individual scanning of the room.
As sad as it may be, I have come to you to discuss far more important matters than simply mourning the dead.
His long whip-like tail began to curl around him slightly as he spoke, and the gesture looked almost defensive, or maybe comforting. Please, allow me to ask you something, Chief, Chancellor Zerlanican then said, and looked directly into the Tenashtasite's face. And allow me to ask it straight out. Are you planning to ask me to reduce our support of the humans over the most recent events? She stared at the lizard's stiff face, trying to read any sort of emotion of it. Chief Wilhelmarth tilted his head slightly as he looked back at her. Then, his body deflated a bit as he let out a long, hissing breath that was cut apart by his many sharp teeth.
I guess our common friends were quite vocal recently about all the things they want to do. And the galaxy has certainly been listening, hasn't it?
He said, after another moment of thought, and he briefly shifted his posture a bit as if trying to quickly get more comfortable.
It is not like either of our people are the most beloved already. Respected, maybe, but we, as the galaxy's largest sapient predators, are certainly not exactly well liked.
Zerlanican nodded, slowly. It wasn't untrue what he said. Although they never had it quite as bad as the Tenashtasite due to being less prone to and focused on direct confrontation, it was true that the Parasanin had never been one of the galaxy's golden children. And their current alliance with the humans, even though it was forged from a bond of deep honor and paid for in blood, certainly didn't exactly help with that.
Theoretically, no one could hold it against us should we turn on our neighbors, now that they are so publicly painting a target onto their backs.
Wilhelmarth continued to elaborate on the answer to her question.
In fact, it is not unlikely that our standing within the galaxy might improve a lot should we decide on that course of action. Not only because we will be agreeing with the majority's will, but also because, with our borders directly enclosing the human territories on many sides, we would basically form a wall between them and the rest of the galaxy, which is something that many people surely would want as an added layer of protection for themselves.
At this point, Zerlanican cracked up slightly, her beak clacking in amusement. I wouldn't want to be the wall that the humans would have to break in order to get what they want, she admitted in amusement, but also quite earnestly. Then she tilted her head slightly as she looked at the chief inquisitively. If you are, how do they say, gassing it up quite as much as you are, I am assuming that it is not the course of action you are going to suggest here.
Wilhelmarth laughed. You are a smart woman, he replied, and nodded his large head, while still hissing in delight. Indeed, I have no interest in shedding my plates and crawling away, or even worse, turning to bite the neck of the Bacchae guard.
He brought one of his hands down onto the desk in between them. He did so rather gently, but the force was still enough to cause a rather sizable banging sound.
One of the greatest virtues of my people is to measure ourselves against others and determine our places in the world,
he said, and his burning eyes twinkled as they all shot straight to Zerlanican, and he stared her down with all four of them.
The dancers and the Miat are both formidable, and so are the allies they seem to seek. Even the Ligomordalar, those my people have accepted as the greatest, to so rarely walk among us a long time ago, have shown that they accepted the smaller Deathworlder's standing. And we may not hold that same title, but we respect it. Humans, Miat, Ligomordalar, Rushgak, Lakshasset, Grabhinur, and even Irrealized. They are names that have demanded respect and were willing to back up their claims.
The lizard then scoffed slightly, as his gazes began to spread out again, leaving only one eye to linger on Zerlanican's form.
And who would the other people to choose be?
He asked, his voice containing heaps of venom and sarcasm.
A bunch of plateless thinkpigs. Few of them are standing next to us, and even fewer of them do it proudly. From our side, in the view of my people, there has never really been a choice. So no, Chancellor, I did not come here to ask you to lessen your support of humanity. I'm here because we and the Parasine are bound by bonds of honor and respect that run deep, deeper than many of those cretins could ever understand. And we would like to see if those bonds still bind you as well.
Zerlanican looked at the chief for a long moment before she let out a sigh. She shook her body, making her feathers puff up, causing her to appear a bit bigger and more within the Tenacious-sized dimensions. She looked directly into the one eye that was still fixating her. I can't say that I share your enthusiasm in dismissing our fellow people within this galaxy, she said, with a rather firm and displeased tone. Not sharing our values and sensitivities in no way makes them our lessers. She then inhaled deeply, the nostrils on top of her head taking in gallons of air into her massive lungs, as she prepared to speak again. However, she then continued, and although he had seemed affected by her words for a moment, a glint of curiosity now erupted within the chief, and caused more of his eyes to turn towards her, as he waited for her to take up the word again. Zerlanican folded her clawed hands, and released a long breath before she raised her voice again. Our alliance with humanity is based on both honor and debt. When we were at our lowest point against them, there was nothing forcing them to conduct themselves according to our rules of conduct. I think, apart from some of our more zealous citizens, there was not a single person in the galaxy deluded enough to make themselves believe that we would have stood any chance against humanity's armies in a direct conflict. A conflict that we would have started, meaning we couldn't have expected any outside help during it. And yet, they agreed to all our terms. They didn't just meet us halfway, they came all the way towards us and met us at our home. They played by our rules, and they beat us fairly. And after that they lifted us up again, and then they gave us their respect. Although we were the ones provoking conflict, although we were the ones who had their rules followed, although we were the ones who lost, they still offered us their respect, to us and our fallen hero. She exhaled another gallon of air, before she finally finished with, Whatever comes next, we will not forget the debt we owe them, and we will not forget the respect and the honor they have shown us. If they trust this realized, we will trust it as well, for as long as they do, we owe them that much. Chief Wilhelmuth released a low hiss, and slowly but surely, his gaze turned sly.
It is good that we agree on that,
he replied, after a few long moments of simply making that sound,
because we would very much like to have your support with our efforts to assist the dancer's candidate.
Admittedly, James let out a bit of a yelp, as he suddenly found himself lifted off his feet and hoisted a few meters up into the air. After flailing about like an angry child on pure instinct for a couple of moments, he finally turned his head to his attacker. 4 orange eyes looked back at him, and narrowed slightly as they met his gaze. "Hey," James then said in a displeased tone, after his first shock had sufficiently died down, his flailing stopping as he allowed himself to just limply hang in Conglorch's grasp. "What gives, man? You know, picking people up just 'cause they're small is pretty..." Sheeta's ears twitched slightly from a noise and told her to stop in her step, just in time to avoid being hit by a flying body, as James's entire mass suddenly came hurling through the open door before her. The fall had little impact on the man in this gravity, as he bounced off the ground once and then rolled a couple of times, finally sticking a 3 contact points landing, standing deeply crouched, with one hand flatly on the ground. A moment later, the large form of Conglorch pushed itself through the doorway that James had just seemingly been thrown through, and the human's eyes narrowed to the giant Tenaciocyte who, in a gesture that was clearly meant to mimic a human's behavior, pressed the palms against the backs of his fingers in order to induce a loud cracking of the knuckles. By now, the feline's ears stood straight up as she observed the scene in front of her. What exactly had she just walked into here?